On the 21st of January, 1968, 40 years ago, we started the Battle of Khe Sanh, which was won due to the efforts of brave soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, and simultaneously with that 77-day battle, the war was lost.
We depend on the American support, that means funding, that means air support, But I think if we got that kind of support, I believe the South Vietnamese, we can fight the war ourselves.
I think that the news media should study specifically the Battle of Khe Sanh and the Vietnam War because it provides great lessons about where we are today. We won the Battle of Khe Sanh. We won the battle on the battlefields of Vietnam, but we lost the war. We learned a lot of things about valor and what it means to be a soldier. We also learned a lot about working with allies. And we're relearning those things today in Iraq, where there are hundreds of American soldiers and Marines working with Iraqi counterparts. Just as Nhi and I worked together as two young captains back in 1967 and 68, and were able to accomplish together, because of the teamwork and the trusting relationship that existed, something that most people thought was impossible. We destroyed or rendered combat ineffective a North Vietnamese regiment with a total of 11 losses. Khe Sanh also provides that bigger picture into the political and military objectives and how they have to be dovetailed so that you don't win the battle and lose the war. The 40th reunion of what, in my opinion, was the most decisive battle of the entire Vietnam War began on 21 January 1968. On 20 January, Captain Nhi and myself and a patrol of about 50 men set out and went southwest of the district headquarters and set up a little patrol base, and we were doing a reconnaissance to see if there was any sign of North Vietnamese activity. While we were there, we received an urgent radio message relayed from the Marines through the Special Forces saying, "Get out of there. Move out now." Well, being the obstinate young captain that I was, I said, "Why? Who's telling me to do that? They don't have authority to tell me to do that." And I then got the message back, "Move out." Well, I knew the voice on the other end of the radio, and so I knew that we probably better get out of there, and we did. And about 30 minutes after we left the area, a B-52 arc light of 3 B-52s dropping tons of 500-pound bombs pummeled the area. Well, this was very important because if we'd run into the force they were trying to bomb, we probably would have been eaten for lunch. Everybody except us knew the North Vietnamese were coming. They had radio intercepts as far back as October, early November of 1967. They knew who the units were. They knew when they were coming, almost to the day, from radio intercepts. But nobody bothered to tell us. This suggests that maybe in the overall scheme of things, we were expendable. And I have to say it was probably that case because they didn't want what they knew about the North Vietnamese plans to get back to the North Vietnamese, and therefore they didn't want to tell us. General Giap wanted a strategic victory. He wanted to end the war. He was being bled to death in the U.S. strategy of attrition. He was also concerned that the U.S. would invade North Vietnam. To be exact, in the spring of 1967, we now know that he conducted many multiple division attacks and artillery attacks against the DMZ as a way of finding out U.S. intentions. Would the U.S. react and invade the North? When they didn't, he felt free to move those divisions that were defending the DMZ around through Laos and to attack Khe Sanh. Giap was also a master strategist. He understood that the U.S. center of gravity, that which would define the outcome of the war, was public support, not the battlefield in Vietnam. And of course, this had been the French experience with their victory in North Vietnam, or their loss in North Vietnam to Giap, and significantly the loss at Dien Bien Phu. Conversely, General Westmoreland wanted a set-piece firepower battle. He wanted a battlefield void of civilians where he could apply the technology and weaponry of the U.S. military against the North Vietnamese. He saw Giap coming long before he got to Khe Sanh. To be exact, there's evidence now that in November or late October of 1967, the Military Assistance Command Vietnam staff knew that General Giap's intention was to attack Khe Sanh. There are many authors who write that the whole North Vietnamese attack on Khe Sanh was a diversion. I think that doesn't stand up to good scrutiny. And here's why I say that. Number one, Giap knew he needed a political victory, not necessarily a military victory. He had then 3 different ways to do that: seize Saigon, seize Hue, or to defeat the U.S. forces, the U.S. and Vietnamese forces at Khe Sanh. If his goal was to divert forces away from the coast to Khe Sanh, what he did was attract them, because the whole 1st Cavalry Division, Air Mobile, was moved north so that it was set up just outside of Hue. It was able to effectively blunt the attack on Quang Tri in Tet and facilitate the re-seizing of the Hue Citadel in February of 1968. So that argument of a diversion, to me, doesn't make sense. The Battle of Khe Sanh was just as it was meant to be. It was meant to be a psychological victory for the North Vietnamese. In April of 1967, the Air Force, as it was returning from bombing missions over the Laotian border, always liked to drop their bombs so they didn't land with bombs on board, because this was a hazard to the aircraft. Well, they mistakenly bombed the village of Long Vey, out near the border.
Somehow the American jets drop bomb, accidentally drop bomb on the Long Vey village, and result in probably 150 casualty to the civilian, the crew particularly.
Well, the people in Da Nang, both Vietnamese and U.S. military leadership, understood the importance of the Bru, the Montagnard tribe, in the area in terms of support for the Vietnamese government and the provision of manpower for both the surveillance and observation group people, for the Popular Force troops in the village, and for the troops with the CIDG and Alpha 101 in Long Vey. So they immediately dispatched the beginning of an advisory team with an Army major by the name of Jim Whitenack and his operations assistant, Sergeant First Class Humphreys.
I was informed by province chief that say I'm going to get a advisory team. I'm glad I was very glad to know that, because before that, you have no American team within the district.
And as Jim tells it, they were basically put on the ground in Khe Sanh by helicopter with their World War II vintage carbines, a PRC-25 radio, and a case of sea rations. And that's how the advisory team began. I got to Vietnam in July of 1967. I came there as a first lieutenant, but I was fortunate in that I had already been to Ranger School and Airborne School, and because of the drawdown in Germany to support activities in Vietnam, I had assumed command of a 165-man airborne cavalry troop as a second lieutenant, less than a year's time in service. And so I had a year's command experience of a company-sized unit under my belt before I ever went to Vietnam.
I graduated from the military academy in Dallas, and myself is known as a minority among the Vietnamese population.
I like to talk about the siege of the combat base as a 4-act play. The first act is the groundwork is laid, and then the village is attacked. This is the background. This lays the situation. The second act, or maybe it's just a sub-act of the first one, is when the Long Vây Special Forces camp, which was west of the district headquarters in the village of Khe Sanh, was overrun by the North Vietnamese using tanks for the first time in South Vietnam. The next act is the 77-day siege of the combat base. Nhi and I both experienced that, and there's some very interesting lessons to be learned, not only about warfare, but also leadership in some of the things that went on in the combat base. And finally, Operation Pegasus. This is when the Battle of Khe Sanh was finally won, and simultaneously, the war was lost. History doesn't very accurately record the fact that the biggest ground action of the whole Battle of Khe Sanh in January through April of 1968 took place in Khe Sanh village, not at the combat base, which was about 5 kilometers to the north. That morning of 21 January, it was extremely foggy. Visibility was measured in feet, not even in yards. But fortunately, we had put out a whole group of trip flares. So when a trip flare went off, you could see this very dull orange light burning. And the Marines and the Bru Montagnards and the Vietnamese that were on the perimeter knew the general area to shoot. And so they fired in the vicinity of those trip flares. So the trip flares worked, and the initial defense was successful. But the point that needs to be made and that everybody needs to understand is this wasn't a big coordinated defense initially. It was each one of those Vietnamese, Montagnard, or Marines in his individual fighting position fighting. It was not a U.S. military victory, as most books about the U.S. military would like to portray it. This was a group effort with Vietnamese and Montagnard soldiers fighting right alongside their American counterparts.
We actually have 3 different group people. We got the Vietnamese, we got the American, and the Montagnard crew. But yes, you work together, you bond together, and most importantly, we trust one another. I think that is the main factor, beside the air support, artillery support, you call it. But that bond makes our morale, make up the camaraderie among us. So if somebody wondering how this one group people, one group soldier, could fight up a large enemies like that, I think so. These books give them a very clear answer. With our small forces, but with the strong artillery and air support, I very strongly believe no way the NVA could have overrun the base. I have a strong belief there.
The fact that this was the first seat of government that ever fell to the North Vietnamese Army, the NVA, is not also recorded in most history. And that's what made it so hard. And this is not only my opinion, but that of my province senior advisor, a civilian by the name of Bob Brewer.
Unofficially, what I got the announcement or the information, they said, well, your guy won the battle, but you lost the territory. Say, that means the government seat. That's why the abandoned the districtship was a big shock to the Vietnamese government in general, but to the province, to General Lam, particularly losing a political post, a district to the government is a big thing.
Those of us that were in the village were, in fact, expendable to the bigger cause, the bigger strategic objective of fighting a set-piece political battle. Had they warned us, had they told us it was coming, they were afraid that the word might get out, the North Vietnamese might not come. So in the overall bigger scheme, it didn't matter whether we were survived or not. Now, your first blush, that kind of makes you a little bit antagonistic and a little bit upset. But, as I've grown older and become more of a senior strategist, I understand every once in a while you've got to sacrifice certain individuals or certain things to achieve the bigger good. And this is the end of Act 1, if you will. The district headquarters has been evacuated. The 282nd's relief had failed, and we had gone back and destroyed everything of use in the district headquarters. This begins what is called the agony of Khe Sanh. From 21 January 1968 till 7 April 1968, we have the 77-day siege of the combat base. During those 77 days, there was no major ground assault. There were 5,000 Marines, Vietnamese Rangers, Special Forces, Vietnamese soldiers, Popular Force Montagnards, and U.S. Army Special Forces, and my own little small advisory team that participated in that 77-day siege. During the siege, I occupied a bunker at the northwest corner of the Forward Operating Base 3 compound. It was the highest point in that area, and I had an observation post up on top where I had a sniper scope and a night observation device. And the sniper scope was useful because occasionally I might see something out there and I'd try and take a shot at 400 or 500 meters, and I think the closest I ever did was throw up some dust at one of their feet. But at least I was able to let loose some of my frustration of being pent up. I got pulled out in about the 20th of March or so to go to join the 1st Cavalry Division, which was planning Operation Pegasus, which was the relief of the Khe Sanh combat base. And because I was the only American officer who'd been on the ground before and during the siege and knew the terrain, I was brought to advise the commander, General Tolson, of the 1st Cavalry Division. The result of this was I worked with the plans officer, a Major Paul Schwartz, on the planning of the operation. We originally planned a series of airborne, air-mobile attacks to progressively build fire bases going along Route 9, while a Marine regiment with engineers was attacking directly down Route 9 to clear the route and build bridges or byways across where the bridges had been. We knew what the division's next mission was going to be, which was to attack into the Ashau Valley. Major Schwartz and I anticipated pursuing the North Vietnamese into Laos and then turning south and going into the Ashau Valley, which was the gateway to Hue, from the backside, thereby gaining strategic surprise and tactical surprise and catching the enemy unprepared. On the 1st of April, as the first helicopters were launching towards the combat base, we presented this concept to General Tolson, and he cut us very short very quickly by saying, obviously, you didn't hear the president last night. He announced a partial bombing halt of North Vietnam. In that light, what you are proposing is politically impossible. I suggest to you that it is that decision at that point when the United States signaled its desire to no longer win the battle on the ground in Vietnam. The decision had been reached. We were not going to reach a military victory. We were going to try and negotiate an escape from Vietnam.
I liken the General Westmoreland like a whip on his troop, his power. I liken him to a heavyweight boxer on the ring. But for political reason or other reason, like allow him to fight with one hand. Right? He cannot pass over Cambodia. He cannot cross for Laos, and he is not allowed talking about the North move to the tactic. The North be in about the NG. So if I think if the American force, have a more freedom to fight the war, I believe the outcome would be different.
As it turns out, with the defeat that the North Vietnamese suffered during Tet, the fact that they basically exposed and had killed the entire or most of the Viet Cong apparatus and were defeated every place they turned, military victory was within the grasp. However, conversely, political victory had been lost because the combined political, military, diplomatic strategy had worked. The American public had been led to believe that victory was not possible, even though it was in hand. So this is a very significant point when you think about the convergence of political and military objectives. So in conclusion, the biggest ground attack battle took place not against the Khe Sanh combat base, but against the village where Captain Nhi and I worked as a team. And I would suggest to you that on the 21st of January, 1968, 40 years ago, we started the Battle of Khe Sanh, which was won due to the efforts of brave soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, and simultaneously with that 77-day battle, the war was lost.
You somehow get the people on your side. When the people on your side, I believe that you can protect the South Vietnam.
One of the things we learned out of Vietnam is the criticality of keeping political and military objectives synchronized. Theoretically, the military objectives flow directly from the political objectives. In other words, once you have achieved the military objectives, you've created the conditions that allow the political objectives to be achieved. Well, but the Johnson administration and the theory of limited war, they bounced all over the ballpark in terms of what the political objectives were. You know, we had bombing halts and bombing escalations and no-fly zones, and then Nixon did the Christmas massacre over Hanoi. Continual change in political objectives, peace with honor. But we didn't always come up with a corresponding military set of objectives, and therefore we were fighting a war that wasn't going to achieve our political purposes. And, one of the things, the theory of limited war, we were trying to fight the war, as Nhi said, like a boxer with one hand tied behind his back, because we didn't want to get involved with the Chinese or the Soviet Union. Well, that cuts both ways. If you're trying to send a message to the Chinese and the Soviets, if you show resolve and they're willing to go in and kick butt, maybe you get their respect and they don't push you, rather than if you're trying to be very careful so that they don't have a reason to become involved. So, I would have done the whole political military decision-making process a lot differently at that level. But I was a lowly captain, and nobody asked me.
Maxie, their sacrifice is not forgotten. That's why I not myself appreciate. Thank you for your the book, and I also believe that the spirit of those dead soldiers, I think they also somewhere in the heaven wherever they work. I think they was like to thank you, Colonel Clarke, also.
Historians will tell you have to wait 40 or 50 years after the fact to begin to get it straight. We're coming up on the 40th anniversary of the Battle of Khe Sanh, and I'm hoping we have it straight now.